If you enjoy watching Common Ground online, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution at lptv.org. Common Ground is funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the citizens of Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Rachel Johnson, and thanks for tuning in to Common Ground. In this week's episode, meet author Kent Nerburn of Bemidji. Nerburn explores issues that affect Native Americans, drawing acclaim from the Native community. Recently, one of Nerburn's spiritually influenced writings gained mass popularity on the internet and has been read over 3 million times.
I'm Kent Nerburn. I am a Bemidji writer. Most of my work is in the fields of general spirituality or Native American subjects, the bridge between the Native American and non-Native American communities. I've been doing it now, since the mid-'80s. I was originally trained as a sculptor, and that was really my passion, but it did lead me into writing. Years ago, I got my PhD in religion and art. It allowed me to practice as a sculptor, as well as to deal with the theories of creation. And I spent probably 20 years working as a sculptor, trying to inhabit natural forms. I worked in wood, trying to inhabit natural forms with spiritual values. I tried to base in the human figure, but tried to find the balance point where things weren't simply the imposition of ideas onto the material, but finding the form in the material, letting the material speak. And in the course of that, the one tradition that really believed in the power of the material and the material having the life that animated the forms that it created was the Native American traditions. There were Northwest Coast Indians in the Queen Charlottes who would carve faces in trees. The trees are still there. They would grow up and have the life of the tree change and inhabit the forms that they created. This idea that there was the power of nature as well as the power of the application of idea fascinated me. I've always believed that the human being is a believing creature, not a thinking creature. What we believe may be religious, it may be psychological, it may just be a way we interpret the world, but essentially we're driven by what we believe. And that was my interest in working in the arts. I wanted to see and experience, and to the extent that I was able, create works that expressed the deepest beliefs, that I had the deepest beliefs of the people I studied. I fell into sculpture when I was in Germany. I used to wander the streets. I had a girlfriend back in the States, and I was duly heartbroken, as someone in his 20s would be, and was just wandering, kind of a lost soul on the streets, and started going into these little Bauernkunst museums, the farmer museums. And in there, I came across some of these crucifixes that had been carved by the old farmers. And they had so much more life in them than any of the abstractions that I was studying in graduate school, where we would do such things as discuss theories of salvation across the comparative dimension, or the comparative aspect of theories of salvation in different religious traditions. Well, that was a far cry from seeing these works that have been labored out by these farmers from their pure essence of their own belief and their own desire to communicate something of the spirit. And I said, that's real. That's more real to me. And I set to work that afternoon and I started. I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd always sketched like most people do in notebooks and so forth, but I'd never really pursued it. At about 2 in the morning, I couldn't stop. I was still at it. And I said, this is something different in my life from anything I've done before. I stayed with it. I produced a piece that my sister still has that was a wedding piece for them. It was in the early 70s, and it was a kind of it was a crucifixion, and it was pretty good. And I said, this touches my heart. This is something that's important to me. And I went back to Stanford and told them that I wanted to become a wood carver. And they said, we think you probably need a little time off. We won't say you've had a nervous breakdown, but let's just say that your professional route does not seem to coincide with what we expected from you here at Stanford. So I left. I took a year off and I never went back. And I committed myself to studying sculpture. I said I wanted to become a sculptor and a teacher, and I wanted to deal with the embodiment of belief in physical forms. So anyway, I ended up back in graduate school at a joint program at Graduate Theological Union and the University of California at Berkeley, a PhD program in religion/theology and art, where I told them I wanted to train to be a sculptor. I wanted to teach from the bench. I didn't want to be a theoretician who also sculpted on the side. They were amenable to this. I went and studied in Italy, studied with stone carvers, did as much classical training as I could get, and continued to work as a sculptor. Whatever it was that allowed a person to be a natural, I didn't have. Sometimes I would struggle my way through to something that was very brilliant. But it was always the image that was stronger to me than the sculpture. I could inhabit the emotion. I could find the emotion of something and find a way to fit it into a material. But I didn't have a strong sculptural sense. Anyway, I continued struggling to make a living as a sculptor, and I've often said that a sculptor is a notch up on the food chain from a poet or a composer, none of which are likely to move you into the upper echelons of economic society. But I worked as a sculptor for about, must have been 15 years. And then my wife-to-be and I moved up here to Bemidji. She had a job working for the Red Lake Times, and she eventually ended up at Bemidji State. I continued to sculpt, but she had her kids, and we needed the economic basis of sculpting was absolutely it was absolutely hopeless. So I needed to find a way to make some kind of a living. The opportunity came to go to work in Red Lake. They had a position open for someone to teach history. It was a grant program. And I applied for the job, and they interviewed me, and I said, what I'd like to do is try to collect the stories of the elders. My wife and I, when we had lived in the Twin Cities, had run a newspaper in North Minneapolis. And I knew how to collect materials. I knew how to put it together. I knew how to listen to people. I knew how to get their voices. The people on the school board at Red Lake liked the idea. They said, this sounds good. I was really working off the model of the Foxfire books, which were done in Georgia a number of years ago, where a teacher took students out and interviewed the folks in the hills about everything from making cane chairs to moonshine. And I said, I'd like to just take the students out on the reservation and interview the elders. So we did. And we ended up, over the course of the years, producing 2 books. One was called To Walk the Red Road, Memories of the Red Lake Ojibwe People. And what we did is we went and got photographs from the Red Lake archives, from individual family members. We went down to St. John's. We went to the Beltrami County Historical Society, and then interviewed people on the reservation. And some of the interviews were profound and significant, interviewing Tommy Stillday, the spiritual leader of Panema, was a very deep and meaningful interview. Then there were others where you interview someone and they talk about when they used to slide down the hill into the lake in old turtle shells. So the stories were just wonderful. They poured out. We produced these books. They became pretty significant books. No one had really done anything like this. The students and I got to go to the Minnesota Indian Education Association. I went up to Alaska to British Columbia and talked and traveled with some of the coastal tribes. It was a wonderful experience for me. It was a wonderful experience for the students. And I realized in the course of this work that the Native people had something that I'd been seeking. It wasn't something that I could appropriate and take into myself, but what it was an equanimity about life and an ability to embrace life and death in a sort of in a continuous fashion. They embraced a larger sense of family than I was used to. They had a quiet joy that ran very, very deep. They were a people at peace. And of course, there were all the sociological issues that we all know about over the top. But at the core of their being was this fundamental belief that spirit lives in everything. It wasn't we have this residual Judeo-Christian belief where the human being is at the top and everything is created, everything else that's created is for our use, to somehow use to redound to the glory of God. Now that's fairly theological, but that's basically the idea that the human being is created in the image of the Creator and everything else is lesser. Not in the Native way of thinking, in any of the traditions. It's much more that everything that's on earth has spirit within it. And the spirit that it has within it is meant to teach. And that you learn from the animals, you learn from the cycles of nature, you learn from the winds, you learn from the skies, you live with a humble awareness that everything is a teacher and you are part of the whole. And this was kind of what I'd been looking for in life. The idea that the tree was alive, which I'd run into as a sculptor. The idea that the tree was alive was simply part and parcel of their understanding of the world. The tree was a teacher. And when I worked as a sculptor, and I would work on a particular tree, and that tree had had a difficult life, I could feel its sadness. If it had a kind of nobility, like I remember working on pieces of oak that had a real nobility to them. They stood up to the world like an oak does. Their character was in the wood. Their character was in the action of working on it. Walnut, which I loved very much, was a very recessive tree. It was a feminine tree. It produced fruit for the world. All of this that had been theoretical to me was suddenly actual in the Native way of looking at the world. I found that I had met traditions that spoke to me in a very fundamental and very essential fashion. So I found myself absolutely in love with the work I had done with the Native people, getting to know the elders, getting to teach the students. I felt like I had found a place where I was doing something that was not only important, it was essential. And I decided at that point that I would turn a lot of my work to the issue of giving voice to a Native way of understanding the world. And it's a fine line you have to walk, because there is absolutely nothing in my mind more odious than the white person who dabbles in Indian themes for fun and profit. And there also is the danger of being a dilettante, an exploiter, but that wasn't what I was about. What I wanted to do was give voice to the voiceless, because I had the audience as a white writer, as a person with a PhD, as a person with the bona fides. I could start to bring these stories up, bring out something of the character of the Native experience. And really, at heart, what I was about as a sculptor, as a writer, as anything else, and what I remain about, is trying to find an authentic American spirituality, one that grows out of the land, one that has to do with an embrace of the moment and a consecration of the ordinary, and not one that has to do with ideology and imposition of theological belief. The Native people do not proselytize. They do not try to push their religion on other people. I remember Chief Joseph, when I was studying Chief Joseph, said, we do not fight about religion. We've seen the white people fight about religion. We don't want to learn that. Well, I don't want to teach that. I don't want to share that. But my work as a writer, my work as a sculptor, has always been at heart the work of a teacher. I want to teach. Of course I want to entertain. But to me, the most important thing is that I somehow put forth something of value and significance, that when people read it, they're made slightly better than they were before they read it. Chief Joseph, one of my heroes, said, "Come, let us put our minds together to see what kind of lives we can create for our children." I take this very seriously. I think that the education of the young and speaking to the young is one of the most important things that you can do as a writer. Earlier this fall, I went to Trek North Charter School in Bemidji and spoke to one of the classes that had been reading my book, Neither Wolf Nor Dog. You never know when the touch you make is the touch that's going to change a young person's life. I love the chance to go talk to young people in schools.
We're guests. I know that you've read one or two or three more, maybe more books by Kent Nerburn. Let's be a good audience today, and thank you, Kent Nerburn, for coming.
Hello, everybody. Well, just so you know that I'm not some alien being walking in. My son went to school here in its first couple of years, and I was involved in starting Schoolcraft. And when this spun off as an idea, I was one of the people that was originally involved in just the seed of the idea of Trek North. So I want to talk to you about two things. I want to talk to you about Neither Wolf Nor Dog, and I want to talk to you a little bit about writing. Neither Wolf Nor Dog because you're reading it, and just seeing the author of a book is always kind of interesting to people. How many of you have read it or are in the process of reading it? Okay. And I wanted the book to weave the sacred and the profane, the ordinary and the elevated, the tragic and the comic all together. So it had an integrated feel to it. But almost invariably, when people first come to it, one of the things they spot is the humor. And they like the humor. And I'm glad for that, because I like the humor too. Now, why did the book work? Well, it worked. I didn't know this at the time, but why it worked is because of the fact that I was a white author. I could take the non-native reader and say, come on with me. Let's go out, let's walk into the Indian country, and I will depict it as absolutely accurately as I possibly can, and I will hand you over to the Indian people. And they will talk back to you in the person and voice of Dan, and to some extent Grover and Winona. All the things that non-native people, white people, I'll use white as the example because mostly white people were bothered by, I put in my mouth. Like Dan and I are driving through the reservation. We bounce our way back down the hill, then turned onto a gravel road that skirted a dusty amber wash. Houses were set back from the road about a half a mile apart. They all had the look of prefab post-war bungalows gone to seed. Doors hung by one hinge, windows without screens were covered by blankets. The front yards were nothing more than spotty patches of dirt with kids' bicycles and old appliances lying randomly on the ground. Everything seemed to have been left just where it was dropped. There was no sense of order or indication of effort to keep things clean. One house had an old spool table sitting in front of it with a pile of oily car parts on it. Another had a large frame made out of telephone poles with an engine block hanging from it by a heavy logging chain. Beneath the engine, a rusty beige Chevrolet with no front wheel sat on heavy timbers, its hood open as if the engine had just been extracted like a tooth. It was a world of half efforts. Nothing had been brought to a conclusion. The only sign of industriousness was the inevitable line of laundry flapping behind each house in the ceaseless prairie winds. The white sheets seemed like flags of defiance in a landscape of despair. I'd always been mystified by the willingness of people to live in squalor when only the simplest effort would have been required to make things clean. Eventually, I'd come to shrug it off to the old sociological canard that it reflected a lack of self-esteem and a sense of hopelessness about life. But in my heart, I knew that this was too facile, too middle class in its presumptions. But it certainly was preferable to earlier explanations that people who lived like this were simply lazy and shiftless. I wanted to ask Dan. I was sure he'd have a point of view. But I hesitated. The question seemed to run to the heart of the contemporary Indian life. I needn't have worried, though. The old man saw me glancing around and came right to the point himself. "Bothers you, doesn't it?" he said. We passed a house with a burnt-out station wagon lying on its side in the front yard. "Yeah, I guess so," I answered. "I just don't understand it. I've been waiting for you to ask, but I guess you figure I got forever." He gave me a mock blow on the shoulder. "I'm damn near 80, Nerburn. You got to work faster." I grinned at his humor. "Sorry, Dan. I'm on white man's time." He chuckled several times and pointed at another of the passing houses. The top of an old Plymouth protruded from a patch of weeds. "What do you see when you look out there?" he said. "Do you really want to know?" I asked, didn't I? "I see a lack of concern for the land you claim to revere." "You mean you see a bunch of right?" His candor was liberating. "Yes. That's what all white people see. You drive through our reservations and say, 'Look at all the junk cars and all the trash.' What do you think we say when we drive through one of your cities?" "I really don't know." "We say the same thing. Just because you have everything scrubbed down and in order doesn't mean anything. What's bigger trash, a junk car or a parking ramp? We can tow the junk car away. The parking ramp has to be torn down with bulldozers and wrecking cranes. The only reason you don't see it as trash is that you still use it. When you don't need a building anymore, it's too expensive to fix, then it's trash. To us, it looks like trash all the time." Well, in there, you see, no native person could come out and make that same statement that I made about, yeah, it looks kind of like trash to me. They wouldn't, because you'd want to defend it if you were native. You want to defend your culture and your life. But all the white people driving through reservations always whisper, "Why do you have like that? What's wrong with the people living there? You could just do anything." And so I can take that point of view, and I could do that. And I could be the voice of the white inquisitor and seeker, and then the native person could respond to me and say, "This is how it really is, and here's what you're not really seeing." You know, I like music a whole lot more than I like reading and writing. I write for a living, but music is what matters to me. But that doesn't mean that music isn't in the writing. Listen to this. All right, what is that? It's a beat. Poetry. Boy, you are on over there. Okay. My cat Sid is a very fat cat. His belly hangs almost to the ground. There's that sentence. Beat out. If you're really, really paying attention to your writing, you listen for the music inside of your writing, and you make it fit the needs of what it is you're trying to say. If you're doing something that's frantic, is moving quickly, you write with a lot faster music. The key, though, is not, you don't do this consciously. You've got to get real good. You've got to really get your chops. And then when you get it, this happens naturally. If you sit down and say, "Oh, no, I'm going to do staccato musical sounds," you know, maybe it's a good exercise. It's like playing scales, and you have to learn it. But better to just be aware of this when you're writing and try to find the music inside of the sentences that you write. I'm sure you're all well aware of that astonishing thing that the human brain does. If I play you the first 4 notes of a piece of music, you're going to know what that piece of music is if you know it. How can that be? What is that in our brain that allows us to just grab a piece of music instantly? And that's a power. And as a writer, one of the things I do to grab you is I'm constantly aware of the inside of the music in what I write. I care about the music of my writing. It is not insignificant to say that I was trained in religious studies. I studied religious texts. Prayer in any tradition has a rhythm about it. The 2 things that matter to me are music and pictures. I want people to see what it is that I'm writing about.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Common Ground. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
If you have a segment idea for Common Ground pertaining to North Central Minnesota, contact us at legacy@lptv.org or call us at 218-333-3022. If you enjoyed this episode of Lakeland Public Television's Common Ground, consider making a contribution at lptv.org.